scientist, above all, I try to be agnostic related to the theory, so I try not to take any stance, okay? I try to be, because I'm not a policymaker, I have probably that space to try to explore certain things that might not be popular within a policymaker's environment, okay? Although I'm working with policymakers, I try to be very agnostic in terms of the different type of literature, obviously trying to recognize the strands, each of the strands of the literature. I'm going to talk about, we are going to do a contribution in the methodological sense, first of all, although there are some empirical results. Probably the most important contribution is going to be in the identification part. This is something that we have decided after the years to focus on. My co-author, Alessia Paganini, is a macroeconometrician, and Emmanuel is more on the management side and behavioral side. But actually, we feel that we can contribute to literature more in the methodological side. So I'm going to start my presentation talking a little bit about this paper of Econometrica of Angeletos and Lau, 2013, about what is sentiment, and a little bit is just a framework that is related to the animal spirits. Okay, as we know about Keynes, they create this kind of idea that actually is part of a rational scheme. I mean, it's not something that we can just consider and think initially as irrational, but it's actually that we can incorporate as in a rational agent type of framework. And actually, there are two examples there of some sentences where we measure the sentiment, and this is a hierarchical process actually that gives you first if there is sentiment or not, and then the type of sentiment is positive or negative, okay? In the first case, Jerome Powell in Sintra said some words and said some pain, and it says non-neutral, 80%, and actually is negative. But then we have another sentence that it actually says painful shift, okay? And look in the nuance, okay, that probably for someone that is not native speaker of English like me might says, okay, well, this is negative, but actually the system detects that it's actually pretty neutral, okay? The way the expression is written, okay? And this is the type of environment that we're going to work. The methodology, I'm going to explain a little bit why we selected this one, but first of all, a little bit of background. I try to be, when I'm in a central bank environment, try to be more approachable of the results of the methodology. And first of all, one of the reasons in terms of motivation, okay, I mean, it's a field that is growing. We have here tomorrow a presentation by one of the leaders of the field, Michael McMahon, and it's a field that is growing in central bank communications. And the role of communications within, I mean, big institutions, central banks, I think, are leading the way. As a policymaker, I think in the future, probably one of my conjectures is in terms of climate, there will be some non-profit, non-government institutions that will be look more similar to a central bank than what we have today. And actually, communications is a very delicate and important process within central banks. You can imagine, for example, the Federal Open Market Committee. This is not happening anymore in this room, okay? But imagine that you have the minds of all these important economists trying to agree on what they are going to write in the statement. And actually, something that we decided to take is that I thought we have the Federal Open Market Committee statement is probably the most famous and most important document. We go for documents that might have some more flavor, because when you have the statement, it's something that reduces a little bit this part of the motion that we construct, because something that they discuss and they have to agree, all of these economists part of the board. Well, in the speeches, okay, actually it's a statement because the database is named this as a statement. It's actually the speeches of the chair. And these documents might have, okay, some more sentimental part from although they are reviewed by people of the bank, they have more space, okay, to have sentiment. One important part is there will be an optimal, okay? We have, as an economist, this idea of the Pareto optimal. This is in terms of the amount of information. Actually, there is a literature, Morris and Sheenan, that actually try to analyze what is the amount of optimal information there, as Benson criticized the excessive amount of public information, but we have come in the empirical way to see that actually more information and better information actually is better, but there is always an optimal that we have to find. Too much information probably can create some noise to the market, and too little probably can create uncertainty. But the market knows, and I think this is something that probably will disagree part of the audience in terms of what the market can know about what the policymakers are deciding. But this is a pretty important paper of the literature Cochrane and Piaccesi, where they actually give some ideas about this puzzle, about who knows better or who is leading the way, and somehow the market is trying to predict what are going to be the decisions, okay? This American Economic Review of 2002. So what we do? We basically try to measure a kind of sentiment profile from the communication of the chair, okay? So we try to take their speeches and their statements, and then given there is an issue in terms of identification. This is a classical problem we have in macro events, that we just have to move to certain data. Probably the most important contribution is this methodology of creating a new measure of monetary policy uncertainty that comes from the literature of entropy, and we call it the monetary policy entropic uncertainty, okay? This is well developed theory. Actually, there is a methodological paper in the third round of review of a methodological journal, but it's a well-developed in financial econometrics. And the idea is we want to offer, okay, this is a point of identification in terms of when the speeches are released that actually do not coincide when the statements or when we have, the natural instruments elaborated in the literature, so we can offer this additional signal in a way to improve the identification part, okay? We should expect that probably emotions will increase uncertainty. It's actually something that will be opposite that what we find, okay? The information will convey, okay, the sentiment will convey information for the markets in terms of the uncertainty of the future decisions. What we use is something, and trying to cross-section literatures. Actually, my colleagues that are going to present today are going to do something very similar in terms of something that is well developed. I come from computer science, actually did machine learning in 2002, and actually this technique is pretty simple, but it's not a black box. This is something that we can go deep on and fully understand what we are doing, okay, with the naive-based classifier method. And basically, we have the sentiment from a non-expert point of view, okay? We try to use this, and the question that we try to solve is that there will be a change in the monetary policy uncertainty in terms of when a statement on a speech is released. I mean, this will have certain effect, okay? Will that be related more to the environment, or will be related to the speech itself? The sentiment within the speech will reveal certain information. Well, we want to explore that, okay? So this is the roadmap, basically, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about the measure, the data, and then some about the results. I'm going to try to give you some intuition about the model that we are trying to develop. So the sentiment, this is well established in the literature of sentiment in computer science, okay? This has more than 6,000 citations by the time we wrote the draft in 2021. I think by now it should be, I didn't check, but it should be probably 8,000, 10,000 citations, this methodology of sentiment. And basically, it tried to extract, it will be similar to my, the next, probably the last presenter, in terms that it is dependent on the training set. It will have a training set, okay, and this training set were basically reviews, okay? There were assigned some sentiment. It's something similar that is traditionally done in the literature of machine learning and computer science, that actually take kind of some input data for training the data set, and then this is reviewed by the person who assigns certain sentiment to the whole statement, and then there is a Bayesian process to try to invert this and try, find what is the conditional distribution that given the sentence or the statement was assigned certain sentiment, what was the sentiment of each of the words contained within the sentence. So we will have that is hierarchical. First, the methodology will decide if it's neutral or non-neutral. And if it's non-neutral, then we will assign a positive or negative. So we review back, okay, this is probably something interesting from the empirical point of view. We go back to the chair Burns from 1970, okay? And we have about 1,000 documents that we review about the speeches the chairs have been given, and we have 6 different chairs that we review. This is an example, okay? We can apply the procedure just to sentences or to the whole document. We apply it to the whole document. And then what is interesting, the aggregation part, because you may decide, okay, probably there are some positive parts, negative parts, but on average what we have, and then the methodology just assigns at the end one general sentiment to the whole document. We can see in this example that it was pretty positive, but it has certain things about, data that actually is ungraded, that is a sentence that actually has no sentiment. Okay, now, one concern, it might be, well, we have the LLM and GPTs, and we are trying to explore literature on that. Sofia Kashenik from Richmond Fed now moved to Stanford, and colleague and friend, she's exploring a lot of that literature at the moment. And one question says, why we shouldn't use one? Why you don't use, for example, GPTs or LLMs? Actually, I did this question, okay, to ChatGPT. I mean, what will be better, okay? And ChatGPT responds, it says, recognizes, that will be if you are in a rigorous environment. Remember that at some point we decided to move on with the rigorosity in terms of using machine learning, because it's okay, we cannot delay a little bit of the results, but we are doing science, and to do science, we know that those results at some point, we will get to explain them, okay? So we prefer to be on the stance of being more rigorous, so we go with this more simple approach, and actually ChatGPT agrees that this will be better in terms of the rigorosity of the method, okay? These are some descriptive results, and then you can see that Paul Volcker was pretty much tagged as emotional, while Ben Bernanke was less emotional of the sample, okay? And then we come to the model. We try to get this idea that actually the market is trying to understand and trying to forecast and to predict what is going to happen next in terms of the decisions, okay? And sometimes the market will have a stance in terms of what they believe is going to happen next, trying to, to take kind of a lead in terms of what is going to happen next, because we are talking about money, okay? These people are doing trading and they're trying to make money, so better prediction is more money, okay? So they have the incentive. So then we take a finance approach with arbitrage and try to establish kind of a la Nakamura and Steinson or Gertler-Karadi a little bit with this approach of arbitrage, and we take this approach to try to kind of identify what is the uncertainty from these events, but we introduce this concept of entropic uncertainty, and suddenly we jump, okay, there are the details for the reasons that escape to the time, okay? We produce a model that basically take this and produce an equilibrium, and within that equilibrium we extract basically what is the entropic uncertainty. And basically the idea with entropic uncertainty is related to that we will have a distribution and entropy increases. It's very interesting, the concept of entropy, because it's universal, okay? Something that applies all of us, okay? The universe tends to average, okay? So we tend to disintegrate, basically. And in this sense, well, you have a more plain distribution about what might happen in the future in terms of if it's going to be hawkish or dovish, okay, will increase the entropy. Well, if you have a more aligned decision towards one, if the distribution is more peak or more, for example, normal, you will have that the entropy will actually be lower, okay? So a greater entropy will mean more uncertainty, okay? And we use that concept to try to define this measure of uncertainty. So we apply identification process using structural BAR, and actually what we did is we tried to use the McCracken, famous now, becoming pretty standard in the literature, and we tried to use this plus 100 macro variables, and try to use two approaches, because one of the problems that we have with such large number of variables is that it will be pretty difficult, so we have to regularize that. So we apply two approaches, one with PCA and try to extract the factors from these macroeconomic variables, and then including, okay, in the structural VAR, the part of the sentiment and the effect over the monetary policy and tropical uncertainty. We compare as well with the traditional, more traditional approach of Bauer and Lagwadala, monetary policy uncertainty. That actually is different because they actually analyze the options, so it's the risk-neutral uncertainty, okay, implied in options. And actually what we find is quite different. We see the effect, okay? Actually, after including these plus 100 variables, we still see that there is an effect actually from the sentiment to the monetary policy and tropical uncertainty. The other approach that we take, in addition to the PCA, is the traditional lasso, and we select 10 out of the 100, the most representative, but also we regularize with lasso the plus 100 variables, macroeconomic variables, and then the 10 more representative are selected, and actually we still see those results. Although we are showing here just the PCA ones, you can see the paper, the ones with lasso. Now, this is a picture that I like to show a lot. This is one of the first things that I did. This is in terms of time aggregate in the difference between both. It's pretty descriptive, pretty for to understand that actually in the gray we have the what will be the neutral one, and in blue the sentimental one on the non-neutral. And actually, when you are neutral, you are increasing kind of uncertainty. So this is the wisdom behind this, okay? And there's a lot of work to do here. This is not definite at all. I mean, we just want to make a contribution from the methodological point of view, and then we want to offer that. But actually, literature is moving towards that in terms of there is some, I mean, other works at the literature, and we are going to see something today about that. Sentiment is actually playing a role, okay? How do we define sentiment? Probably I'm going to take more about that in my discussion, but it's pretty straightforward that we can see that it's playing a role. So, finally, to conclude, well, the communication is a very delicate process, okay? I mean, it's very elaborated. Every central bank will have their own, I mean, they will have commonalities, but they will have their own way to take the process. And remember that this will be more delicate when we have at the zero lower bound that was predicted by Bernanke and Reinhardt in 2004 AER, okay, that it will be key. And actually, we believe that our contribution might probably help, okay, in the future to try to detect other indices and do a better identification of the process. I think I have 30 seconds, but I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much for the organizers for the invitation, first of all, to discuss this very interesting paper. Enjoyed reading it a lot. It's a very rich, extensive, polished work, so congratulations on the paper. Let me just spend 2 minutes or so to summarize the paper from my point of view in a nutshell. Well, from my perspective, this paper has 3 contributions. First of all, they have this new indicator for monetary policy uncertainty. It's going to refer to short-term monetary policy uncertainty, so what the policy rate does over the next, say, 1, 2, 3 months. And it's based on, the finance perspective arbitrage between futures and target rate. So that's a new measure of uncertainty that, future research can work with. Then the second contribution is, they measure sentiment of FOMC statements like many do, but then they additionally go to these chair communication chair statements. They use machine learning, naive Bayes, and they are mainly interested in whether the communication is neutral or non-neutral, which they also sometimes call emotional in the paper. But, Juan didn't quite, highlight this in his presentation, but they also look at hawkish and dovish, actually, besides that. And one of the main findings they have here, they find a lot of stuff, but, Juan quickly mentioned that these chairs have different textual sentiment profiles. So based on the text, based on the lectures they have been given, you can, for example, say that Volcker and Greenspan are more emotional than, say, Burns or Bernanke. And then in the third step, they sort of combine the previous two steps and they estimate the effect of the chair sentiment on monetary policy uncertainty. So they essentially ask if there's a new statement by the chair, is monetary policy uncertainty changing over the course of the next couple of days? And they find, maybe surprisingly, but I would be interested in the discussion, that an increase in sentiment, so if you go from a neutral to a non-neutral statement, that actually reduces monetary policy uncertainty. So that's my maybe 2-minute summary of the paper. And because this is a very polished paper, I'm not going to ask for additional robustness checks or stuff like that. If I counted correctly, the acknowledgements list 40 people, 20 conferences, so there's a lot of work in this paper already. So I'm focusing on asking a couple of questions how we should think about these results, right? What can we learn about these results? So my first comment is on uncertainty. So, this measure, this monetary policy entropic uncertainty, this is based on 1 and 3 months futures. So it's capturing uncertainty about the short term. And the first question I would ask is, so how large is this short-term uncertainty relative to, say, uncertainty about the future path of interest rates? So I brought a graph, this is for the ECB Bloomberg survey just a couple of weeks ago, where you essentially see that for the upcoming meetings, everyone in the survey sort of agrees, right? They expect a decrease by 25 basis points in April, then another one in June, and in July, maybe some outliers, but then, the whole dispersion really occurs for a couple of months more outside. So I think this sort of captures the point that maybe the uncertainty about the next 2 meetings is generally relatively small, whereas, for example, also now in the current hiking cycle, or now we're in a loosening cycle, maybe it's more the terminal rate that's more uncertain. So is this short-term uncertainty the main part? Is it something that the market focuses on? How should we think about this? And then, obviously, if you would do something like that in a follow-up work, would we expect a similar effect of sentiment on the longer-term uncertainty as opposed to the short-term uncertainty? That's for the uncertainty part. Then the second part, or the second comment, is on the sentiment. So you find that only 3% of the FOMC statements and 2% of the Fed chair statements are negative. I found that quite small. I was kind of surprised. I don't know what the audience thinks about this. So for me, it's maybe a bit surprising, given we face a lot of macroeconomic challenges in the last 50 years, more or less the sample size. So what can we make of that? It's like a very neutral question. Just curious about your opinion about that. Again, something from my work, this is just a comparison for the ECB, where if you look at the share of negative statements in ECB statements, that's actually, let's say, 30% on average, maybe sometimes going up to 50%. So is the Fed more positive about the general communication? Is the ECB quite negative? How should we think about this? And then, you have this finding that not neutral statements decrease the uncertainty. then, I mean, you mentioned it in the talk, sort of, that's the follow-up for upcoming research, right? Is this different for positive and negative statements? So what is it really that drives the content of the emotions? Does the topic matter? Is it different whether I have a positive tone or a negative tone? So what is the effect on uncertainty in this respect? That's the second comment on sentiment. And the third one, you know, coming from a central bank, obviously I'm interested in policy implications. So I have a question regarding the speed of the impact. So you mentioned in the paper, you probably didn't have time to mention it here in the presentation, that actually the speed of the effect of on uncertainty has decreased over time, right? So it became faster over time due to markets processing the information faster. So, you know, now we have all these new technologies, AI, should we expect this to, you know, proceed even faster, maybe take even less than a couple of days, maybe a couple of hours, minutes, you name it. And then, you know, the last comment is really for clarification. If I understood correctly, or if I put this into a larger picture, I have the impression that you found that the sentiment appears to affect the second moment of interests, so uncertainty, volatility, while maybe the stance of the communication affects the first moment. If that's the way is that the way how we should think about this? And then if I, as a central banker, would want to reduce uncertainty in the markets, let's say there was a large macroeconomic shock on April the 2nd, and markets were in turmoil, and I don't want to fuel uncertainty any further. Should I resort to more emotional language to kind of, you know, dispel the market turmoil, to kind of calm down markets? Is that what I should take from your findings? That's it so far from my discussion. Thank you very much, and I guess it's time for the Q&A, right? Or maybe Juan wants to respond first. Thank you very much. You can work with the slides if you...
Yes, thank you, Philip. Yes, yeah. Let me try to. Thank you. Thank you for the comments. Pretty helpful, actually. So to try to address just a couple of them. I mean, we can talk privately afterwards about the third one. I mean, but regarding the part of the last comment in terms of the sorry. Yes, in terms of the second moment, we have that this is related to what we can observe in terms of how the markets are moving forward, okay? That's actually is in terms of the direction, okay? So it's more about the direction, and this is not something that we will say strongly in terms that, yes, we believe is the most important. I mean, central banks need to have a stance, okay? Definitely. This will affect. If the central bank doesn't have a stance. I will say that because then, when there are changes, okay, if you look when there are changes, we can observe a change. Well, probably in here, there was a change in terms from a more hawkish to a dovish, okay? That is really a big shock. That's the reason we said first moment. We should be more precise. It's not about first moment, but it's a larger shock to the whole event. Then we have, when we have actual a decision that says, okay, they have, you know, decided that there will be a dovish stance for the next months and the next probably year or so. Then there is this uncertainty about how much is going to be the effect. So yes, when we said the first order moment was related to the change, okay, from going one to the another one, that's probably more important. Related to the short term, certainly. Thank you. That's great comment. We tried with 6 months, but then it complicates the model if you aggregate 1, 3, and 6 months. But we will try to explore. One of the issues that I have with longer term uncertainty is that I don't know if we can be sure what we are going to say about that, because it's more difficult to, to assess longer term uncertainty. You have more things. Well, in short term, okay, we can probably say more, okay, but certainly it's a great comment. Thank you for the comments.
Well, thank you both. Right. Well, thank you. We're going to have questions from the audience now, but before we do that, I just want to take advantage from the fact that I'm here to pose my own question first. When I think it's fair to assume that when someone is more certain of what they're saying, let's say about the assessment of the economy, they would probably use a more emotional words, like this is good, etc. As opposed to when they're not so sure, they probably would use more a neutral language, probably accompanied by words like it's possible that, it's likely that, perhaps, it's probably that. So I think that maybe controlling for uncertain words could be a good robustness check, in the sense that I don't know if some of the factor capturing, if any, is the fact that people are more sure when they're listening to someone talk rather than they're not sure. So I think it would be like controlling for uncertain words. Since you're already using dictionary methods, I think it should be fairly used to implement that that check, just to be sure.
Thank you for the comment.
Any questions?
Thank you. One very nice presentation. So I kept thinking during your talk about the Mario Draghi statement, we will do whatever it takes, right? So this is probably non-neutral, as an example. I know you don't have the DCV here, but just to bring that example to the board. And I was thinking, so statements like those, you see them happening mostly during crisis, right? During special events, periods of high stress. And this is maybe a bit different to what Vanessa was commenting, because maybe it's not necessarily about what you know or you don't know about the reality, which, although it is important, but also about the strength of the message you want to send because of being in a special situation, right? And the question I had is whether you see in your data that these non-neutral statements are somehow clustered maybe around those events. Is there a correlation, like a sort of time clustering element in terms of those no-neutral statements being located or focused more on periods where we see stress going on and central banks wanting to send a stronger, more clear message to the markets? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Matthias. Regarding about the sentiment and the sentence of Draghi's, one of the things that we want to be clear with terms of the sentiment is that, remember that sentiment, I'm going to speak more about that on the discussion, is something subjective. So it's pretty hard to tackling that. What is sentiment really? Because, you will have that will be cultural related, okay? And actually, that's one of the powers of machine learning, that is actually you can feed, but you don't want to overfeed as well. So probably, I'm not sure that statement will be, we can check as well, we can do that afterwards and see how emotional it is, the statement, okay? But the part of the environment certainly will play a role, but this is the first thing that we wanted to cross-check, that is not driven. Actually, what we in one of the analysis, we do a causal analysis in terms with lag variables, and actually we see that observing that lag analysis, that actually a sentiment that we explore is kind of has a orthogonal component from the causal point of view. So it's causal somehow, and it's actually not cause mainly driven by the environment. Yes, this is one of the most common comment we receive, but to be sure, this is I mean, obviously there will be driven, but there will be levels of driven part, and then there is one part that is your own reaction, okay? And that's what we try to disentangle. Not just the reaction by the environment, but what will be an additional reaction, okay? And just to give you an idea of what's happening with you have the periods of Volcker and versus Burns, you had pretty bad periods, and they responded very different. I mean, in terms of the hyperinflation of Volcker, or the higher inflation times of Volcker, and then the crisis, the Great Depression of Bernanke, were really bad periods, and they responded completely different in terms of the speeches that they did. So there was a personal part into the speeches, and that part actually affected the uncertainty. One thing as well is in terms of the part of the conditional part, is that one thing, this is a conjecture as well in terms, I mean, for the future work, is that market is reacting because it wants to understand what policymakers are going to do. So you're trying to predict decision of you, okay? Probably not the state of the economy, probably market knows the state of the economy, but they want to see how the perception of the state of the economy perceived by central banks are included into the reaction function, and basically that's what probably market. This is, I mean, something exploratory that we're trying to analyze in terms when, for example, press conferences are released and how the market continues to react after the press conference, in terms continue to add information. Is okay, we see the statement, the FOMC statement, but we want to see more about what is happening in terms of what the central bank is going to do, more than what is the state of the economy, because probably market has more analysts that a central bank has, and they probably try to see better what is the reaction of the central bank. And then when the communication happens, they understand better what is going to be the reaction function of central banks.
Thank you all. We're having Philip next. Thank you.
Okay, so once again, thank you to the organizers for putting us on the program, for this nice invitation. Pleasure to be here and to present our work, which is called Monetary Intelligent Language Agent, joined with colleagues at the Bundesbank. It's a mixture of economists and IT experts. Quite early stage, work in progress, so very much looking forward to your comments. So the paper title is already kind of hinting at the question we are asking, and it's essentially, can we employ artificial intelligence to analyze monetary policy communication, but in the same way as a real-world economist would do it, right? Can we kind of create sort of like a digital economist using AI? The reason or the motivation for this project is that monetary policy communication is incredibly important. There is this nice quote by Ben Bernanke, who once said, 98% of monetary policy is talk and only 2% action. Maybe you don't agree with the precise numbers, but certainly monetary policy communication is incredibly important for the monetary policy stance, because communication is going to affect private agents' expectations about, future interest rates, and then this is sort of reflected in medium-term interest rates, for example, at the market. So you can think of, communication, or we are going to think about communication in two forms. First, direct communication about monetary policy instruments. Say, I, as a central banker, I go out and I tell you, I'm going to keep my interest rates low for the next 2 years. But then there's also indirect information, how I talk about the economic situation, how I talk about the economic narrative. At the ECB, you have in the press conferences the first part, which is talking about the decisions and kind of like the motivation. And then there's the second part, which is like, I will now outline in more detail how we see the economy, and then there's a long list of facts and observation about the economic narrative. So, and given that, monetary policy communication is so important, it's not unsurprising that both research and markets analyze communication very closely, and they are going to do so with respect to these two dimensions, which we already mentioned. On the one hand, the stance, hawkish, dovish, or neutral, and then the sentiment, so is it positive and negative. In the research community, it kind of fits into this so-called narrative approach, which is a term coined by Romer and Romer in 1989. And they essentially say, look, you can go to qualitative sources, you can go to texts, and use that to identify macroeconomic shocks. Now, this has been quite popular. So 2 years ago, Romer and Romer wrote another article, AER, where they took stock of the narrative approach, and they essentially said, well, it has worked out pretty well. And then they forecast that the main way to use the narrative approach is going to be the old-fashioned one. We're going to sit at our desk, we're doing a lot of careful reading by the sources ourselves. We don't expect to be made largely redundant by computers in the next few years. And in our paper, we sort of challenge this notion a bit. We kind of ask, okay, maybe, Romer and Romer are too pessimistic, depends on whether you think this is a positive or a negative development. But we sort of think, well, maybe you can already use AI for this narrative approach. Maybe you can already design sort of a digital economist that reads through monetary policy texts and evaluates them, and then you can use them in the narrative approach. So what do we do in this paper? We develop a novel methodology in the artificial AI, in the artificial intelligence world, and we're doing so to evaluate monetary policy texts. And we want to do that in a consistent way, in a detailed way, and in a transparent way. I'm going to be more specific what we mean with those adjectives in a minute. So we call this methodology MILA, Monetary Intelligent Language Agent, and at Bundesbank that's now sort of our new digital colleague, our new digital economist who accompanies us and reads texts for us. So there are three main features that we're going to focus on. We want to do a granular analysis, kind of like on the sentence level, but taking context into account. We want to know why MILA assesses certain statements in a certain way, and we want the results to be replicable, obviously. And so far we have mainly looked at ECB communications, so ECB press conferences and speeches since Mario Draghi became the president. This is about 50,000 sentences, and we made some small case studies. One is on the dovish bias discussion, and one is on a particular October 2022 press conference. If I have time, I will tell you more about these two cases. But let me first of all kind of tell you how this fits into the related literature, because if you know what happened in the related literature, you can kind of appreciate what we are doing. So, you have this sort of basic idea, you want to evaluate monetary policy texts, right? You want to kind of say, okay, is this monetary policy text or is this statement hawkish or dovish? Is it positive or negative? So first, let's say early 2000s, there was a lot of human labeling. So as Romer and Romer put it, experts, economists sitting at their desk, evaluating on their own. You can imagine that this is quite time consuming, right? If you sit at your desk, you read everything, you try to see, okay, is this statement really hawkish, is it dovish, and so on. We know that humans are subjective, and there's really no way to control how you use context. Say, for example, I'm an expert on ECB, so I know a lot about ECB in certain periods of time. Another economist might use a different context when looking at the same statement. So it's very hard to control the amount of context that is put down in this respect. So therefore, the literature has sort of evolved into these word frequency or dictionary algorithms, which is essentially, you take a long list of words or combination of words, and then you count how many times they occur in the text. Say, for example, I look for inflation increases. If I see those two if I see this combination in text, I'm going to put a +1 for hawkish. If I see inflation decreases, I'm going to put a -1 for dovish. So, and then you have a long list of these combination, let's say unemployment increases and so on and so forth. So versus human labeling, that obviously is more speedy, right? That's a computer-based algorithm, but it's fairly mechanical. You can't really use context, you're just merely sort of counting words. So you're also susceptible to nuances, say if I change the language a bit, I'm gonna miss it. So then the next evolution step was were these specialized language models. And if you are familiar with this literature, they're all, or most of them are based on this model BERT by Google. So they are called like FinBERT, Roberta, or variations of this theme. And actually there was a nice article by colleagues of Douglas at the BIS, evaluating these specialized language models and also some early LLMs, how they fare. So the main, advantage of these models is you can incorporate manual classifications. So, Juan showed us an example of that. You can, include some examples, and then the model is doing a quite good job in evaluating statements. However, this fine-tuning is quite costly, and it's mainly application-specific. So let's say, if I fine-tune a model for the ECB, it's not really clear if it's going to work well for the Fed and vice versa. So this fine-tuning can be quite cumbersome. So, fast forward to, let's say, the last 2 years, we all know by now these generalist large language models, GPT, Perplexity, Gemini, you name them. So there have been some early adopters who have looked at, can GPT decipher Fed speak? That's the word of one working paper by colleagues from the Fed. And in fact, these large language models, they hold quite large promises because you can interact with them via prompt engineering. So you can provide context, you can provide example, you can ask for explanations. And if I ask you, please evaluate a monetary policy text with GPT, it would take you maybe a minute, right? You can go to any Fed source, copy-paste the text into GPT, ask GPT, what do you think, is this text hawkish or dovish? Give me an answer on a scale from -10 to 10. You're going to get an output from the LLM. However, we are going to argue that this is a stochastic output. It's not quite transparent what's happening in the LLM. And it's also challenging to get the LLM to really do a detailed assessment of the text, like we would like to do for the narrative approach. So, we are trying to sort of marry the advantages of these different approaches while minimizing the disadvantages. And, maybe you can tell me after the talk if you think we did a good job on that. So let me go to the methodology, what we are actually doing. So Mila is essentially a combination of text mining, a large language model, some mathematical formulas, and topic modeling. We're using Llama 3.170 billion currently. That's a large language model by Meta, Facebook. But the methodology is largely independent from what LLM you use, because it's more than just interacting with an LLM. It's kind of putting the LLM in the middle and then putting stuff around it. So in a one-sentence explanation, what we do with the LLM is we are doing a role-based multi-layer prompt chaining with few-shot prompting in each layer. That sounds quite ridiculous if you hear it for the first time, at least from my point of view. So these are all concepts from the recent LLM literature that we're employing. So let's dissect this. What does that mean? Role-based is what you've probably also heard about, is we're assigning the LLM the role of a monetary policy economist. We're telling the model, you are an economist working at a central bank and you're specialized in monetary policy communication. Then we're doing a multi-layer interaction, so we're interacting several times with the LLM, not just one time. And then we have this prompt chaining idea where sometimes, but not always, we use the output from one interaction as an input in the next interaction. So the LLM sort of does a step-by-step analysis. And the few-shot prompting is In each step, we provide some classification examples. We provide some examples how the model should respond, some examples where we think this is the correct answer if the question was this example, for example. So the main task of the LLM is going to be this classification task, so classify sentences whether they are hawkish, dovish, or neutral, and positive, negative, and neutral, but take the document context into account and take the inflation context into account. Why is that important? Document context is pretty obvious. Sometimes you need to know the previous sentences because sometimes a sentence starts with "this was judged to be positive," then you need to know what this is, and it's probably going to be clear from the previous sentences. Inflation context is important, particular for sentiment. Say, if I tell you the inflation rate increased in the last months, that's very much dependent on where the current inflation rate is. If it's above 2%, which is the ECB target, and I tell you ECB, the inflation rate increased, that's probably negative. We're moving away from the inflation target. If we're moving from below the inflation target towards the inflation target, that would be a positive statement. So, with this classification of the sentence level in these different dimensions, we can calculate also the same dimensions for the overall text. So, kind of a Hawkometer and a sentiment score, a bit different, but also similar to what Juan has presented us, where you essentially have an indicator then for an overall document. Say for sentiment, you could do it like that. You can essentially take the net amount of positive sentences, divide by the non-neutral sentences, and then you get a continuous indicator between -1 and 1. 1 is the most positive, -1 is the most negative. So, this is a graphical overview again, just for people who like that a bit more. The input is a document which is processed via text mining. Then the LLM has essentially two tasks. First, do the inflation content extraction, so read the document and tell me whether inflation is currently above or below the target. And then use that for the classification of the sentence, give me as an output on the sentence level a score, hawkish, dovish, neutral, positive, negative, and give me a reasoning. So for every sentence we also get from the LLM a one-sentence explanation. This sentence is hawkish because blah, 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 blah. And then we can use, with the sentence level, we can use topic modeling and these aggregation formulas to arrive at an output on document level, which is then this Hawkometer and sentiment score. So, here's some classification examples. These are all sentences set by the ECB. The first one is a positive statement. The disinflation process is well on track. We're going from above 2% to 2%. The Governing Council expresses its full support to the people of Ukraine. That's actually a neutral statement according to Mila, which I find very nice because it's a statement of solidarity, but Mila then tells us, well, it's a welcoming statement, but it doesn't have any economic content to it, so we're going to classify it as neutral. And then, maybe a bit more on the more traditional monetary policy sentences, the last two. A boost in defense and infrastructure spending could also raise inflation. That's a hawkish sentence, whereas the last one, manufacturing is still a drag on growth. That's a moderately dovish sentence, according to Mila. So I don't know how you look at these statements. Maybe you think at this point, well, it's fairly easy to classify these sentences, positive, negative, hawkish, dovish. It's going to take me a couple of seconds. Well, let me tell you, some of the traditional approaches have a very hard time in classifying these statements. And here's an example where essentially in the columns that are labeled LM and AB, we have some of these dictionary approaches. And you can see that, for the sentiment at 76% accuracy, they're essentially doing fine. But then for the Hawkometer, they are labeling less than half of the statements correctly. Mila does a better job, particularly in the sentiment evaluation. For the Hawkometer, it's also quite an improvement, and here it's actually nice to see that Mila works reasonably well on statements which are not from the ECB. because on the right-hand side of this table, you see minutes from Eastern European central banks. So quite a nice result there as well. Also, if you run Mila several times, you're going to get a correlation of close to 1, which is not the case if you run an LLM several times. So, if we look at that, we think that this is quite an improvement over the previous approaches, especially considering that it works reasonably well on foreign data, let's say, data that Mila is not specifically trained for. So what we have tested, particularly or specific for this conference, is we have looked at the statement from Brazil last week, actually. So last week there was a meeting and there was an increase of the policy rate. So, there's a statement by the Monetary Policy Committee, and we, took just a slight modification, and, we essentially told the model, look, these are Brazilian statements, there's a different inflation target, not the same as the ECB, and, you get a score. And, well, we looked at it, we found it to be very reasonable. According to Mila, the statement of last week from the Brazilian Central Bank was very hawkish, was quite pessimistic. So, to put some numbers behind that, Mila found 13 hawkish sentences, 5 moderately hawkish, only 2 neutral, and only 1 dovish sentence. And then the same sort of direction applies to the sentiment score, where it's mostly negative sentences. So kind of shows us that, this is maybe a quite flexible approach that doesn't need a lot of fine-tuning for one particular application, but kind of reasonably works outside of its original scope. So I'm running a bit out of time, so let me conclude. So, you can, with these, with Mila, you can provide these quantitative indicators, sort of you can score how communication has evolved over time. ECB press conferences have been mostly dovish in the last 14 years, but it has been different for inflation and the real economy in recent times. Sentiment of ECB press conferences, we talked about that, was quite well, was positive, but then, most recently quite negative. And then you can also do a lot of stuff that the previous literature has done. For example, you can estimate whether monetary policy speeches kind of react to the macro environment. So, for example, here we kind of estimate a Taylor rule, sort of asking, so are monetary policy speeches becoming more hawkish if inflation and GDP growth increases? And it turns out the answer is yes. So sort of like a communicative Taylor rule. So let me conclude. So we think that, Mila is a step forward in the analysis of monetary policy communication. It's, state-dependent, granular, and, we can derive these indicators for central bank communication. We want to go even a step further, kind of like in this AI-based narrative approach, maybe together with high-frequency financial market data. Thank you very much for the attention.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to discuss your paper, Philippe, and thanks again for the organizers for including me in this conference, this very incredible conference, and in particular, I think the monetary policy communication session in this room here, we're convening people that study communication academically, that draft speeches, that deliver speeches, so it's a very unique setting to discuss this type of environment. So, and what a great paper also to discuss, I think. So first of all, before even going to the slides, I'd like to congratulate Philip and your co-authors as well for really putting together a very nice interdisciplinary paper that kind of, as you mentioned, it kind of combines, these flashy new tools that we have available to study communication at the same time within a very clear economic context. So I think this is a very nice contribution in this kind of a whole new stream of literature that's coming up. And of course, being done by Bundesbank colleagues, it also has a very clear applied aspect to it as well, in the sense that I'm sure you are also using this internally and to kind of, as your digital colleague, as you said. So congratulations on the paper. So a very brief kind of paper, how I saw it, like some of my takeaways is that you have these monetary policy statements, and in their case, they use the European Central Bank monetary policy statements, and given that they're from the German Bundesbank. And essentially, they take these statements, and according to what they're doing, either in the sentiment analysis or in the Hawk-Dovish indicator analysis, then they do different granularity breakdowns. So for the sentiment at the sentence level, and for the Hawk-O-meter at the paragraph level. And then they then using very clever techniques to, let's say, to query the language model, they ask them, like, play this role model as you're a monetary policy economist. Now tell me what the sentiment or the hawkish-dovish indicator for this sentence or paragraph is. And then, is it intense, is it moderate? And then you have this, let's say, step-by-step approach that minimizes, in a way, how much the language model is what they call hallucinating, or just creating responses that might not necessarily be close to what you're looking for. And the authors, they have done, and what is, it really comes across as a considerable effort to make sure that this application is transparent, to make sure that the language model, the LLM, by the way, when I use here LLM in the slides, those are large language models, that is justifying its rationale for the response. So to give you an example, when they're asking for the language model, what is the sentiment of the sentence? They provide context from the previous sentence, inflation context, and they ask first for the rationale and only then for the response. So in a way, it's kind of priming the LLM to provide, first, let's say, look in this, let's say, knowledge space related to monetary policy, and only then you tell me what the sentiment is. So that was very clever, I think. And so overall, it's a very practical application. It's a progress in the literature, I think. My comments will concentrate on the parts that I think you can fully harness your setting. And I think you can deliver a lot more with what you already have. And so I'm going to focus on this one. And I provided detailed comments in the paper, and I'm happy to discuss them offline if you want as well. So actually, I have a number of comments, but in the interest of time, I'm going to switch the order. And then, of course, I can go back to some of the other ones. So let me... Yeah. So indeed, transparent. There was a point that Philip made, and I think, for academia and for central banks, those are two settings where we really want to be sure about what the model is doing, and we need replicability, we need transparency. And as I said, they have this very smart solution. You break down into these granular components of the text, and then whenever something goes awry, you can look, okay, so what was the sentence that led to this indicator? And then as a human, it's much easier to analyze, or paragraph. And it's much easier to analyze and make sure that it matches what the LLM said. So you can, let's say, audit the LLM's response. But one of the things that you do, Philip, in your co-authors is that for the sentiment, you have a sentence level breakdown. For the Hawk-O-meter, have a paragraph level breakdown. It wasn't as clear as it could have been. So one thing I would encourage is, kind of really justify this, and preferably having even harmonized definitions. What if you just do paragraph for all indicators, and also how robust is this? If you stress test the LLM, switching certain words, will it also switch the sentiment of the Hawk-O-meter indicator, for example? Okay. Now another thing I would encourage you, also in the context of transparency, is a lighthearted German analogy here. You have a Ferrari in your hands. The Llama 70 billion, it's a very large language model, would not probably fit in most of our personal notebooks here. So you have a Ferrari in your hands, take it to the Autobahn and drive with no speed limits. My sense is, what I'm getting at is that these language models nowadays, they can take an impressive amount of text at the same time. And like us humans, when we are reading the speech or reading the statement or, the announcement, we don't necessarily, at least when I expect the way I think about, how I receive those statements, I don't necessarily think about sentence by sentence, but how the whole text conveys. At least as a central banker, when I put this hat on, this is what I want it to be conveyed like. So what I would encourage you is to really harness this evolution that started in the BERT models back in 2018, could only take around 400, 500 words at a time. Now they can take essentially the whole monetary policy statement plus the inflation report, everything at once. So just take the whole statement and just put it to the language model. Let's see what it gives. So as an example, I try and do this myself. I took your system prompt from your paper. So you're an economist specialized in monetary policy analysis at a central bank. And then I took this April's monetary policy statement by the ECB, just one paragraph in order to fit in the presentation. You don't need to read, I won't. But in essence, there's this, statement about what's going on. It was issued 17th of April, so very current. And then the AI's response was like this. By the way, I use an open model, which means that I can reproduce it. It's very transparent. And, I don't want you to focus on the answer here specifically. The answer is interesting, but what I want you to focus is on the process. Every large language model that we know nowadays, they're based on what is called by the IT literature, by the computer science literature, the attention mechanism, which is essentially a way to map the output to each part of the input. Which means that if we take this whole response by the AI model, and I'll focus at a time at each of those 3 bolded excerpts. Okay, so if I want to look at the answer is that, the sentiment is neutral to slightly negative. Now I can actually inspect, if it's an open model, like Llama is, I can inspect the weights, and it can tell me, which part of the sentence or the paragraph informed the response that it's neutral to slightly negative. And actually changes, if you say the inflation is declining, it's only looking, you can see the darker shades, at the parts that convey that inflation is declining. And the part about the deteriorated due to rising trade tensions, you can also inspect, it's kind of intuitive for us humans to see that it really focuses on those aspects. And I'm showing you text, because it's communication, but it's actually, those are all weights, numbers, so we can even do a bunch of exciting econometric analysis with them as well. So I would really encourage you to go and export this dimension as well. Another one that I would go, since I have 1 more minute, is to, so the reproduction. When we're writing papers about large language models, sometimes, you can have the actual model. You can, especially if it's an open weights model like Llama is, you can post your own version to the internet and then everyone can use it, or at least other central banks can use it. But I would strongly encourage you to, for example, to also consider, at least, so you mentioned you do a lot of prompt techniques. So, write in the paper what those prompts are so that other people can experiment. And a final comment about the reproducibility and stochastic response. I don't think those are in the slide, so don't bother looking at the screen. Is that in some open weights models, you can actually ask the model, don't be stochastic. Give me whatever is coming out of your response. You can control the level of stochasticity. But even if you can't, I would encourage you to harness the stochastic nature of the response. Look at 10 different language models and weight their responses. And you can even have a version of, let's say, what different digital economists would have as a response. So I would also encourage you to consider those dimensions. Thank you all very much. And again, congratulations, Philip and co-authors for this work.
Thank you so much, Douglas, for the very nice comments. Very interesting. We thought a lot about this. I like your Ferrari metaphor. We were thinking at times that it was more along the lines of Draghi, where you have a bazooka, and you essentially, you have a bazooka and you shoot at birds, right? So that was kind of like the analogy that we had in mind, because we have all this huge LLM, and we're only evaluating like a tiny bit of text, but using this massive amount of context. So it's a bit also a discussion about the philosophy behind it, right? So how detailed should the analysis be? So I really liked your comments about sentence level versus paragraph level being not very clear. So at some point we had the idea that if you talk about monetary policy decisions and what your motivation behind these decisions are or is, then the individual sentence maybe doesn't play a huge role, maybe. So that's why we resorted at points to the paragraph level. And then obviously that's also going to change if you, for example, go to a different text format. So let's say a speech, right, which has a lot of words around that, maybe only a couple of really key statements are important. So for me, it's not really clear yet if there's an ideal or universally agreed upon text level that is relevant. So, but your comment about the LLM weights is exactly the way we want to proceed. Kind of like we have implicitly like this. Okay, we go to the sentence level, but then we have a sort of uniform weighting scheme. Every sentence is as important as the next sentence, which obviously isn't the case. So, I think we really need to go into the direction of putting some weights behind that and considering that some sentences may be more important than others. Stress testing, very nice idea. Haven't thought about this, to be honest. As a robustness check, should do more about this, to be honest. Also throwing in like random words, really smart. Really like that idea. And then, maybe, we can discuss later on, but maybe one more comment in this round here. So we can control the amount of stochasticity. Well, is that a real word? You can control the temperature of the model. You can kind of control the randomness of the model, and you can set the temperature to 0 such that if you query the model another time, it will give you the same response. We weren't too satisfied with putting the temperature to 0 because then it became a bit, it didn't behave very nuanced, let me put it like that, or it became a bit dumb, right? Like kind of like giving, okay, there's an inflation increases in the sentence, that's always going to be hawkish, even though there was something else going on in the latter part of the text. So again, this also shows that there's a lot of work in understanding these LLMs, trying to see what is the right amount of randomness across LLMs within the LLM. It's not really clear. We're going to this approach where we have this large bazooka and try to avoid the randomness by querying small pieces of text. Maybe that's an idea, but there's a lot of work to do. Thank you so much for the nice comments. Thanks.
We have time for a couple of questions from the audience.
One also has a question.
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for the nice presentation, the nice work. It's very, very interesting. I was wondering if you have considered, or if you are considering to maybe run an analysis on a kind of subsample of speeches and notes of the ECB on the topic of green central banking, and I don't know if you have results on this. What are the results? What are the impacts of these kind of speeches? Since there has been a lot of activity of the ECB in the last 5 to 7 years, so at all levels. So this would be, I think, very interesting, and I would like to know what is your take on these or results. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So, so far we have sort of specifically focused on monetary policy speeches in the narrow sense. Such that it makes sense to have the hawkish-dovish kind of dimension. But the nice thing is now the infrastructure is there, and going to the green central banking speeches should be easy. I guess maybe you have something different in mind, but I would guess that the sentiment would be quite interesting in this respect. Maybe there's another dimension that I haven't thought about so far, but we can definitely do. So the main advantage really, or one of the advantages is really the flexibility, I guess. And then, we can extend it readily, I guess, yeah. Thanks for the suggestion.
You have a question?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Great presentation, great idea, great paper, and you are basically on the lead trying to move the literature in regards to GPT's feed to central bank communications. I have one question regarding the training set and data set. Can you explain that part more? Right. So training versus let me draw a different. Let me make a difference between training and adaptation. Right. So we're using Llama, and Llama is trained by Meta. Right. So they have like this
this training sample, which for my purposes, I always think about it as having knowledge of the internet up to a certain cutoff. What we do is not, I mean, I talked a lot with my colleague about it. We're not training the model, right? We're not training the model in a new sense. We're not having a new LLM, but we're sort of only adapting the model, right? Adapting via prompt engineering, via interacting with the model in a certain way and providing examples. For example, one of the prompts is something along the lines of, you're an economist at a central bank. Your task is to classify speeches in hawkish and dovish. Hawkish sentences typically mention inflation increasing, la 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 la. Dovish sentences typically mention da 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 da. And then please answer in the following output format, right? Alongside a couple of additional information from time to time. So in that sense, we adapt the model, and that's why also the methodology itself is largely independent from the LLM. You could use Perplexity, Gemini, ChatGPT, whatever you like, because it's sort of like a way how to speak with the LLM. That's how I would like to think about it, and it's taking the LLM off the shelf. So we're not rerunning the model, recalibrating any of its parameters or something along these lines. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any more questions? We have 2 minutes.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. Myself, I'm very interested in the subject, and I had a question which was just exactly the same as Juan, but then I would like to hear from you commentaries about how to combine this AI approach with the high frequency instruments you commented in the end.
Right. So I think we're working closely with the financial market experts, and they sometimes tell you, well, I don't need the LLM to know whether it's hawkish or dovish. I just look at the market reactions, and the markets will tell me whether it was hawkish or dovish. And we're thinking about combining it in the sense of just trying to make sense of the indicators, right? Can the indicators that we derive, can they explain whether the markets reacted in a certain way or not? For example, or let me, we have maybe 1 minute. Is that working? Yeah. So let me maybe take this graph as an example. The most negative point you see here on the graph in 2022, that's October 2022. So according to Mila, the most negative press conference in the last 14 years of the ECB was in October 22. Not COVID, not Russian invasion of Ukraine, not the government debt crisis, but October 2022. If you look at the high frequency market reaction to that meeting, that was extremely dovish. There was a decrease of 10-year bonds by 20 basis points in a couple of minutes. And Mila now tells you, well, this is a very, very, very pessimistic statement that the ECB put out in October 2022. And if you look at the numbers, it's actually kind of like there are 40 sentences and there are 38 negative sentences, like one negative statement after the other. So, we really think that, you can use these indicators not in itself, but then maybe also related to the prior expectations to see whether you can explain high-frequency market responses. And here there's a piece of evidence that points us in this direction. Maybe, the communication in October 2022 was so pessimistic that markets were very, very surprised how, pessimistic the ECB was about the economic outlook, and then there was this dovish reappraisal of market interest rates. So that would be an idea. Thank you for the question. And I can head over, I think, to...
Thank you, Philip. Thank Douglas for the comments. The floor is yours again.
Okay, hi everyone again. Now with a bit more time, just like to express how thankful I am to be here, to the organizers, to everyone. It's very good to be home. I know it's been 7 years since I last stepped in this building, and it was a bit of an emotional experience. And it's glad to see so many familiar faces, friends, colleagues, co-authors. So yes, now I'm here to present work with a great team of co-authors. So Nicola Bolkan from the European Central Bank, Fabio Alberto Comazzi from the European Stability Mechanism, and Michele Lenza also from the ECB and CPR. And this paper is entitled Word to Prices. What we do is we embed central bank communication for inflation prediction. And it's an applied work, but in a way, the way we see it, it's also a paper that tries to make a case about how to work with text data in this new brave new world of large language models, etc., in a way that is also econometrically sound for auto-sample tests, for real-time analysis when you need it, okay? So if you're just, for example, doing work that you want to understand what went on, etc., then you don't need this real-time component. Then, very often harnessing, for example, like the other papers, harnessing large language models that are trained on essentially everything that's written, but you don't really know the cutoff or the text, then it's fine. They know very well how to interpret context and nuance, and they will give you a nuanced, interpretation of texts. But sometimes in economics, you need to show, or in finance, you need to show that, for example, text has predictive component, and then you need to do auto-sample tests. Or that a text analysis is good for real-time analysis. And there you have some, let's say, more strict requirements that large language models often do not fulfill because they're not transparent, or actually, and even if they were transparent, they're so large that it's hard to train from scratch, okay? So what this paper argues is that there's someone in between word counts and dictionary analysis as done traditionally in large language models that actually meets the requirements of having a very nuanced and a very kind of a sophisticated interpretation of texts, while giving you the possibility to do auto-sample tests and real-time analysis. So this is what the paper is about in a nutshell. And it's set in the context of, we have, we economists were traditionally used to exploring kind of let's say, quantitative data that fits in an Excel spreadsheet. But now, of course, increasingly, after some great work done by some people in this room, like Mike McMahon as well, we have, an increasing amount of people that are harnessing the economic signal in texts. And of course, in tandem, we had this development of large language models that are really kind of taking off and continue to take off in a breakneck speed. But the thing is, we have tools and we have the data. And we have interesting economic questions that we need to try and answer them. But some of them require us to have this methodological consistency, and this is what the paper is all about, okay? And the way we do to show you that it's actually possible to do so, we take this model that is actually now 12 years old, Word2Vec, was first published by Google researchers in 2013. And we use the same model that it's sufficiently sophisticated to understand word context without us having to explain each word. At the same time, it's so small that it can be trained from scratch in any of our notebooks to tackle a very challenging task, which is to improve inflation forecasts. It's a very challenging task in macroeconomics, and we show that by having economic signals treated the way that we do, what we now call word to prices algorithm, we actually improve on these inflation forecasts, okay? And by doing this, we also harness this word that you may come across at a higher frequency now in econometrics, which is called embedding. So I'll also take the opportunity, a couple of minutes, to kind of introduce this concept to some of you that are not yet familiar with this concept of embeddings, because it's central to how we achieve this. These embeddings, they are essentially a representation of each word in a vector space. So when we're speaking to one another, for example, it's as if we had this cloud of words, every word that you possibly know, they're hanging on top of your head. And when you're trying to talk to someone, let's say at a conference, and you're asking about what they thought about the monetary policy communication session, your word cloud in your head is going to be thinking about inflation, words related to inflation, conference. It's not going to be thinking about animals or about, let's say, sports, right? And in a way, this embeddings concept, it captures this idea that words that are semantically close to each other, they have the same meaning, they have the same, let's say, space, they are closer in this vector space. But of course, we don't observe this. We need to estimate what this embedding space is. Okay, so this is what this whole technique does. And then we can use this embeddings of each word. Once we have this function that maps each word to an embedding, we can actually plug in central bank communications, and then what we have coming out is a bunch of time series of vectors. And it's beautiful for us because we all know how to work with time series. And then again, what we do is we show that using these signals coming from the vector space, we actually improve on inflation forecast. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the literature, which is very important. But what I want to get to now is, can we have a way that we extract information in real time, therefore also with the possibility to use in auto-sample tests to support, for example, monetary policy analysis. It can also, of course, be used to other settings as well, but this is the setting that we chose to apply because of the relevance and the amount of challenge that is to improve on the inflation forecast. And the texts that we choose, they are the European Central Bank's monetary policy statements. They used to be called introductory statements. It works like this. At every monetary policy meeting, the president and vice president of the governing council, they do an introductory statement that is a very structured text that they read out loud. And it starts, kind of with an overview, and then it goes into the monetary policy outlook, and then the economic outlook, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very structured all the way since the beginning of the ECB's history in the early 2000s. So we take all of these texts, and then, we want to know if we embed them in this auto-sample way that I'm going to be sharing with you, can we improve inflation forecast? Meaning, can we extract economically relevant signals? Spoiler alert, we do. So when we put this in a bivariate vector autoregression, what we find is that this measure of this speech that we embedded in a vector space, it can grandeur cause inflation, meaning that out of sample in the next quarter up until the fourth quarter after the speech is done, the forecast improves when we compare to a simple inflation autoregression. Okay? And when we use these very powerful large language models, they also improve, which is kind of obvious, but the problem is, we don't really know what their training cutoff is, what data was incorporated. So when we do a historical analysis, some of it might have had look-ahead bias. So we can't really tell with large language models, even though we know they're powerful. But with our algorithm, it's simpler, but we can't tell for sure that is an out-of-sample test. Some traditional techniques, they do also extract sentiment that is very relevant also for inflation forecasting, but it does not reach the power that our algorithm does. So in a way, what we claim is that we found, let's say, in a way, a golden spot in between the traditionally techniques that we economists do when we work with texts and really harnessing the power of machine learning for analyzing those texts, okay? Now, challenges remain. For example, we don't yet have a mathematical way, a statistical way to pin down uncertainty around these estimates. So this is something that, it's work in progress. Or even the interpretability, as I said, there's still a lot to be done. But, what we show is that there's promise. And if you really need this type of more robust, kind of an expanding window set for real-time analysis, it is possible to be done. Okay, so let me now jump out. I already talked about this kind of continuum from traditional techniques to large language models, and we're somewhere in between. So here's what we do. We start out with an autoregression for inflation. So inflation today depends on inflation lags, and here we use 4 lags. And our research question more specifically is, if we compare the forecast error for this model that only looks at inflation itself and compares with a model that looks at inflation and the ECB speeches embedded with this algorithm, which one has the lowest forecast error? Okay. And again, this mapping, this embedding, what we do is that it's essentially a function that can be learned that maps each word or each part of word into this vector space. Okay. And it's important to focus that it can be learned, because the trick is, how do you learn it? You can use this smaller algorithm, word to vec, to do this. You can also use very powerful language models to do this. Again, with the difference being that one of them, you can fully control all of the details, so it's more robust from an econometric perspective. Okay, so I've already talked about the embeddings. Because of time, I'm going to go to the results, and then if there's any question, I can jump in back to the embeddings as well. Okay, so this word-to-vec, the algorithm that we use, we rename a word to prices in the context of our work, is that essentially it looks at each text at chunks of 5 words at a time. And it tries to predict, it tries to create if I had to map each word into a vector, what is the vector that, for the word in the middle of these 5 words, so the third word, what is the number that will be closest to essentially the average of the other 4? You know, the two previous words and the 2 subsequent words. Because when they are, let's say, closer to each other, it means that that word in the middle, it fit right well into that sentence. But when we do this for the whole corpora of ECB introductory statements, then, and again, those are very highly structured texts, then what it has essentially learned is how to map words in the monetary policy context to one another. The beauty of it is that each monetary policy statement has different words. Of course, they want to say different things, and we've been talking about this morning. So once we learn how to map each word into this vector space, whenever it sees a new speech, it already knows how to map the speech, so let's say it creates a new vector for the whole speech. Let me backtrack a little bit. If we have this function that, you know, successfully is able to forecast the probability of a word being in the middle of a 5-word chunk, then essentially we can use this applied to every word in every ECB speech that we have. Once we do this, what we have in essence is that the speech will have, each word is going to have a vector. So what we do is, for each speech, we average them out. And then we have only one vector. It's essentially as if we were saying, what is the word that best summarizes that speech? When we put speeches side by side, we have a time series of this vector, okay? And what we do then is that with this vector, we then plug into the autoregression, and then we see this inflation forecast. And why do we do this? Because when you train the algorithm yourself, you can do what we consider to be very important to make sure that you have the ability to do auto-sample analysis, which is you do this in an expanding window. So we take the first batch of speeches from the year 2000 all the way to 2007, and we train our algorithm. And then we try to predict inflation for 2008, quarter 1, the first quarter, second quarter, etc. And then we look at all speeches up until the 2008 first quarter, and we try to predict for the following 4th quarters. And we do this in an expanding window way. And why? Because sometimes the meanings of words, they change. So using it as an example that was mentioned earlier today, when in June 2012, Mario Draghi said famously during an interview, a live conference, that they would do whatever it takes to save the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. So those words, whatever it takes, they took on a completely different meaning after that momentous Mario Draghi press conference. Which is to say, if I just had the same mapping of words before and after 2012, they would give me the same result. Whereas we all know from our intuition that if someone said whatever it takes before Mario Draghi said it, it means a completely different thing than if someone else says, like a central bank officer says this today, then you know they're really putting the bazooka up, to use the Phillips language. So this is why we need to, when you do this in an expanding window, essentially the model before 2012, whatever it takes has a more neutral meaning, but after 2012 is going to have a much more loaded meaning. This is the point of having this expanded window. Okay, I'm going to jump this in the interest of time because I want to show you some results now. Okay, and then we also have placebo measures just to make sure that our results are not an artifact of just plugging in more numbers in the autoregression. Okay, so for placebo, we use the count of the word inflation in each speech, and we also use the count of words. So essentially, the ideal results that we want to see is that the errors for the inflation autoregression and this vector autoregression are the same for the placebo. And we want to see, of course, our errors from the worth to prices algorithm being lower than the pure inflation autoregression. Okay. And now I'm going to show you some results to speak that they actually do improve. And they improve also up to 4 quarters ahead, which means that if we're sitting today in 2025 second quarter, then not only it helps to improve the forecast for the 3rd quarter inflation, but also the 4th quarter in 1st and 2nd quarter 2026. Okay. Now, these newer large language models, like OpenAI's models and Llama, for example, they do improve also the response. Again, they know a lot of nuance. They understand English language. They understand context, so they can, pin down signals better. But you cannot use them for out-of-sample tests unless you're doing from now onwards instead of historically, as we're doing. And the traditionally calculated sentiment measures, for example, that when they take the traditional sentiment, for those of you that are not familiar, includes things like if a speech says that the outlook has deteriorated, it's different than when it has a qualifier. For example, the outlook has significantly deteriorated. You can all pick up that this is a much more loaded meaning, and then it is also informative, but less than our algorithm. So here's the main results table. How to read it. We're comparing the AR error, forecast error, out-of-sample forecast error, to our own, which means that when the numbers are 1, they're exactly the same. When the numbers are lower than 1, it means that the alternative model won, the algorithm, the sentiment, whatever. And when it's higher than 1, then actually just the pure inflation wins. And what we see here is that for a horizon of 1 up to 4 quarters, the word-to-vec model actually improves on the pure inflation forecast. And surprisingly for us, also in the 4th quarter, even more than just the 1st quarter ahead. And you can see that the other language models, they also improve and quite significantly, but of course they don't have this out-of-sample component that we discussed. The placebos, as we were expecting, they are equal or let's say even worse than just a pure inflation autoregression because they added more estimates to have. And the sentiment metrics, they also improved, but not as much as our model has improved. Okay, so then we break down into post-COVID, kind of a pre-COVID sample, and what we can see is that, in post-COVID, and it's important to break down because we had this global burst of inflation after COVID starting 2022. And so when we look at the history going back to 2007, all the way up to COVID, we see that our model improved even more. So after COVID, it was challenging for essentially all models to learn, which is why the whole out-of-sample period, 2007 up until 2024, we had an improvement of 17% percentage points, whereas for just before COVID, it was much higher. But still, both have improved. Okay, here's some graphs, and one of the things that may be hard to see on the screen, but one of the things that I want to show you here is that so in blue we have the actual inflation series. And in the dashed line is the autoregress, just pure inflation. So what it does, as you can see, is that, as all autoregressive models do, they're kind of offsetting the main regression in time, whereas our measure is not doing this. It's also kind of, let's say, having a better, fit to the curve in a way. So at least better than the pure autoregressive model. Okay, then we also do a test. So we do this with the PCA. We also do this with a Bayesian model that looks at the whole vector that we created using this embeddings technique. And what we find is that essentially it has the same information. But what I really want to convey before I finish here is that one can always say, well, okay, the central bank speech carries also some information about the economic outlook. And maybe it's not capturing a new signal, but rather the outlook of inflation. And that's what's improving the forecast. So what we do is we take the ECB's own inflation forecast that they use when they're drafting the speeches. And we compare, if we take an inflation model, so inflation ahead, and we have this lambda in our measure, and the 1 minus lambda the inflation forecasts that was done by the ECB economists, what we find is that actually, even when we're horse racing both, our measure inflation forecast based on embeddings, they have, let's say, the optimal inflation forecast uses half our forecast and the other half the ECB's own forecast, which means that we're finding additional signal even beyond what ECB economists are incorporating their forecasts, and that are, reflected in the speech itself. So we suggest a simple way to use word embeddings that is, robust and kind of afford you some, let's say, nice properties if you're using this in an econometrically sound setting. We also showed that in a very challenging setting, which is help improve inflation forecast, that we actually are able to extract signal using this technique in a comparable way to more powerful models that are, less, might be less robust depending on the setting. And we do this using a very simple model that, because it can be trained from scratch, essentially, I mean, it's very easy also to use in applied work as well. So thank you all very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Douglas, for your presentation, and thank you, the organizers, for allowing me to learn a little bit more about the topic. Actually, this is difficult when you have to discuss a paper where you are not an expert. It's just because, I mean, it happens to be the session organized in that way, so it's okay. But I will try to give my bit of my grain of sand to try to help you to polish the paper. I enjoy reading the paper, and I think it's very challenging, very risky, I will say, to try to do probably my first general suggestion will try to pin down the contribution, because you're doing many contributions, probably try to, in the polish part, to try to pin down the contribution. I will try to speak briefly about what they do, because sometimes that helps in discussion, sometimes it's repetitive. If you are an expert, you know what they are doing, but actually the technique is new, and probably that might be helpful to show as well what is my understanding. So basically they use these data, the data of the introductory statements from the ECB that basically is very important, and I'll show you probably later in the Q&A section that actually is pretty informative, that part. I mean, there's a lot of trading activity occurring at the time. And actually, some of the nicest things, I mean, is the approach of the out of sample. Financial economics literature these days are really, really punishing anything that has look-ahead bias. There are a few retracted papers in the Journal of Financial Economics, in particular one related to literature of risk pricing, asset pricing, from some co-authors, Turan Bali and co-authors, that actually was, giving an example that should be done. So that's very important in terms of, the approach that you are taking. It's really, really, really nice to see that, okay? And then you're trying to find with the methodology, try to extract a little bit of the policy language. That's pretty nice, because you are kind of training, okay? Dynamic training, the tool with the time evolution. That will be, I think, really, really strong part from your paper, okay? Now, regarding the technique, okay, I'm going to try to explain a little bit my understanding with the technique is related to what literature has been done in the past, actually to naive Bayes. It's context related, you have to train it. Actually, Miklov, it has, I just checked, it has 47,000 citations, so it's pretty standard, okay? So it will be, just for having an idea, the same as the citation that you have with the GMM paper of Nobel Prize winning paper of Hansen. Obviously, they are different literatures, I don't want to compare them. But to say that, it has been widely used, okay? Pretty well established in computer science literature, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, okay? and then make some comparisons, okay, to pre-trained LLMs. I mean, this part of the time series training part, okay? It makes some comments, it made some analysis related to create like a placebo with the AR process, okay? Trying to measure, for example, inflation counts, okay? And I made a comment there that, I did send you already the comments, that probably you have to want to check as well in the publishing part, all the results like Ferreira, I don't know if here, that has pretty, you are like kind of a cluster in terms of research, and probably you want to include that into comparisons in the paper. One of the things I'm commenting on that is nowadays, financial economists, and I think macrofinance will move towards that in terms of the robustness, because p-hacking these days is horrible. Let me be clear, okay? When you have all these techniques, p-hacking is, just happening all over the place. That's the reason all these papers has been retracted. And we have to be careful. If you have in the design 20 variables, then you will have to consider 3 or 4 different versions of those 20 variables of your design to really convince the reviewers that what you're doing is not p-hacking, right? So this is an example, a quick example that I did just to try to understand. You have this sample text, and what the tool I just asked to ChatGPT, give me a 101 example where I can understand what word to beg does. And basically they train a neural network, okay? It's a 2-layer hidden neural, two layers, one hidden and one another layer neural network that basically is trained, okay, with the data. And basically if you have a word, whatever that word is close to another one, it will basically kind of be closer to that word. That what will happen there probably is not fine, but it says human language, for example, and because you have that in the text, it will appear, okay, in your vector projection, okay, closer, okay? So basically, it's pretty context related, what might be good or risky in some situations that you have to take considerations, okay? You apply PCA, some pretty standard, okay, that basically first 4 PCs, principal components have 50-70% of the variance, okay? This is the specification. You have something very important here because you're using a Bayesian approach. You have Michele as well that published key literature in this topic as co-author, and probably is a pretty strong from the point of view that you have one of the experts in related to that. But I will say that because you are doing an empirical kind of effort, maybe comparing to not Bayesian, I'm going to try to be the devil's advocate in terms of a lot of work to do here, because this is okay. Probably is because it's Bayesian that you have the contribution, or is not related to that. Traditional structural BAR might be helpful. I'm just wondering to try to see where the parts contribute to, and I cannot really see if Bayesian is contributing to the results or not, or, because you have several results, and trying to disentangle will be very helpful for the reviewer, okay? Now, you have the results that actually the placebo, you have that if the ratio is close to 1, there will be kind of no contribution, and actually what you're observing is the ratios of your mean squared errors are below 1, that actually there is some contribution actually happening, okay? And there is some details, technical details that I will give you. I will just go over that. You mentioned open questions. You have to probably polish that and close on those questions. There are many open questions at the end, and then probably you want to tackle some of them in terms of what you're doing in the paper, okay? In particular, something that you might get a reviewer that might, be willing to go deep down in one of these open questions that you are telling the reviewer that it will be addressed later, or maybe the reviewer wants to see it within the paper. Now, I'm going to stop here and talk probably in the remaining part about sentiment, because this is something interesting. We are talking about sentiment, and sentiment, one of the things that orthodox economists will challenge this. So micro people don't lie. When I'm presenting the things about sentiment and this methodology, they don't like this idea that's pretty vague, okay? And then I went to work a little bit more on trying to understand why is that. And then there is a famous neuroscientist, Andrew Huberman, is pretty mainstream media popular guy, but he has quite interesting research, okay? He's an academic from Stanford, and actually he divides like the brain activity between, the literature, he mentions that, and he came to realize that this is related to our work somehow in sentiment, because prefrontal cortex is more on the logic part, in the parts of econometrics and identification, while the hypothalamus, okay, is more related to the theory. And when we have this idea of sentiment, it's vague, it's not well defined, it's not unique. We have different definitions. It's very important that when there is something driven there that probably we need several measures, okay? And it's very important that, so whenever we have the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the hypothalamus, this will be the kind of connections that we were doing with the measures and the identification part. And this is pretty nice because probably this is what is happening in our minds when we are working with these things as policymakers, okay? How we are kind of machine learning type of tools. We don't know. There are theories about serious people that we live in a simulation. I don't know if you have read that, people from MIT. But anyway, so major comments, okay, just I will tell you that just check, okay, on the design in terms of the part of the identification is very important. You have kind of this issue that we have always about identification, about between the mix, okay, a frequency in between the days that the shock occurs and when you are doing the measurement. This is pretty sensitive, and I will try to work more on offering different designs for that as well. And in terms of the last two comments are related to the multiple shocks, like try to see the monetary policy not as one shock, but shock that is going to occur in the future, like several changes in the future. Okay, and then are some comments in terms of the econometrics. Shapiro-Wilson is a very important paper about inflation, the estimate that might not be exactly related, but is key in the literature, and I will add that. Okay, so those are my comments.
Well, thanks very much, Juan. Those were a very good set of comments, and I'll definitely follow up offline as well. Thanks so much for very carefully taking a look at our work and kind of suggesting these comments ahead. A lot to take in. I will have to use both my cortex and hypothalamus to think more about the brain analogy, but so I'll come back to you on that offline. But yeah, one of the things, so precisely, you mentioned a lot of kind of the consistency, let's say even the p-hacking, et cetera, the look-ahead bias. This was the main motivator for our work to do this. And in fact, the setting we chose is arguably simplistic. Just forecast inflation. So for example, we didn't look at the term structure or anything because we wanted just, a challenge that was intuitive, that was simple, and that has a very clear benchmark to beat, which is the AR. And, we, the profession, have been trying to beat this, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, which is why I also wanted to do this over a long-term range. But those comments are very well taken. I'd just like to elaborate very briefly on something you mentioned, the technique. I didn't go into detail because of time constraints, but essentially this word2vec is a neural network. And when we think about neural networks nowadays, we think about these massive, kind of algorithms driving YouTube recommendations and all, but the way that these algorithms work that we use in the paper, they're actually comparatively small, but they're still provide a very effective representation of these words. So also to try and pin down with your comments. So in the paper, what we do is every word is mapped to this 100-dimensional vector. It's as if one part of the vector is saying if the word is, let's say, more hawkish, more dovish, another one is more positive, negative. We don't really know in human terms. All we know is that in aggregate, this vector of 100 numbers is closer to another vector of 100 numbers if there are words that are close to each other. And I think your code in your plot showed this very well. We have like human and language close to each other because they go together more often than other words in the text that you used. So this is something also that I'll take the opportunity to make clear as well. Let me see if also, in terms of disentangling results, I think it's a very good comment. in the sense that, for example, when we go into the Bayesian autoregression, the reason we do this is just to make sure that once we have this 100 vector time series, so essentially a panel data, where each point in time is the representation of the speech. When we use this in a vector autoregression, we want to be, of course, also concise. We don't want to necessarily put in the whole 100 vectors. What we show is that if we just take the PCA of this time series, you have essentially the bulk of the information, because it has broadly the same forecast as if we did put the 100 ones, but using this Bayesian vector autoregression that effectively chooses where the signal is coming from at each point in time. So this is kind of the purpose of why we had both the PCA and the Bayesian vector autoregression, just to show that, even if you have a vector of words, and it's very complicated, very long, but if you just take the principal components, then you're also doing fine. That was essentially our point, and that we can, of course, consider how to make clear as well. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Douglas. Are there any questions from the audience?
Well, thank you. I was wondering, you mentioned, your paper says that the virtual prices does a better job at predicting inflation than the AR1, right? I was wondering why this happens. Is it because there's a Phillips curve behind it? Like the central bank says, I'm going to tighten the monetary policy so economic activity cools down and then inflation goes down, or happens in the other way, monetary is to lose, I have to tighten, and then inflation goes down. So is it a Phillips curve behind it? Or so if you compare to a Phillips curve, it will do a better job? That's the question.
Thank you. It's a very relevant question, and we ourselves, the co-authors, we thought about this, what could be possibly driving this. And in fact, we continue to do analysis with this type of work, because when we just compare with what the ECB officials had in mind when they actually delivered that speech, as I showed you, it actually goes beyond this. So could be some signal about even their policy reaction function, still to be defined, but we'll be happy to provide updates as we continue our journey to understand. So, but thank you for the question. I think there was a... And by the way, very interesting test to compare with the Phillips curve as well. Thanks.
Thank you for the very interesting paper, actually for the three of you. I actually have a sort of similar question, which is related to, I guess the question I'm going to ask is actually related to the three papers, okay? And I have to admit first, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not an expert on this field. I still have some doubts about the real meaning of sentiment, like that kind of, I was asking that question myself of what is this meaning of sentiment. But what I think is that wording is probably related to the business cycle, right? The wording of these communications. Not only with the business cycle, but for example, distance from inflation from target and stuff like that. So that I was asking myself about the classifications, for example, that Philip showed with relation to the hawkish and dovish, and asking myself, well, it seems, especially when you put the last Copom meeting, the Brazil Monetary Policy Committee meeting, it sounds to me that it's more realistic, some of them at least, right? And when you showed your last results, that you kind of I'm not going to pretend that I understood all the technique or the methodology, but it seems like you try to put into some context, right? So I was wondering whether putting into context would be something like controlling for a business cycle measure or sort of a deviation of inflation from target, these wordings, which for me would kind of give more proper meaning, whether it be more hawkish, more dovish, and whether it would kind of be more, the information content of the communication would be kind of important for forecasting inflation. That's it.
No, thank you very much. Maybe I take the first part and then Philip. So about the context, the way we do in our setting, we actually bypass this problem altogether, because when we compare when we take a model, let's say the optimal reconstruction of inflation, when we have the forecast using our textual measure and the ECB's own forecast, and when this model tells us that actually these signals, they go hand in hand, meaning we have additional signal beyond the forecast, I am sure their forecast already considers the state of the business cycle, the distance to target, even the intended policy measures that they would eventually take. So their forecast kind of incorporates all of this. And the fact that our textual measure has additional signal beyond it, kind of in a way is already controlling for this context as I see it, if I address your question. Maybe for time now, on the sentiment, Philip, if you want to come in.
Yeah, I just want to say I sympathize with the notion that you just outlined. You know, I'm still struggling with, you know, what is the meaning of sentiment in the central bank sphere. I think, you know, in terms of movie critics, where, you know, we have a lot of training data, that's pretty obvious, but then what's the meaning in central banking? I'm not really sure. So is it, you know, I mean, it would be interesting for you, Douglas, to maybe look at if you know, the embeddings, do they correlate with sentiment more than, for example, let's say hawkish dovish? So what's, you know, also in terms of what are we capturing, right? Like what piece of information from the text are we really capturing in trying to see what's beyond what's inside there? Because I think the exercise you had where, you know, you put half the weight on the text and only half the weight on the projections is quite a strong piece of evidence that there is something in the text that is beyond the numbers from the projection. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Juan, maybe also, since you also worked in the sentiment, also with this very kind of interesting model.
Yes, and thank you for the question. The topic of sentiment, I mean, we are really starting to understand. Look, this is something, I'm a mathematician, so I'm really agnostic about all these things. I mean, what a mathematician, applied mathematician is doing trying to analyze sentiment, but it's actually how difficult is trying to work on this that actually attracted me. And one of the things is that there are some interesting things that we might say, like for example, on the work of Sofia Kashenik on sentiment, on the phases, they found that actually literature is pretty strong. For example, there are 7 universal type of sentiments. They explored that. There is a psychologist that worked heavily many years on that. And whenever they came, the literature moved forward to that. Kornichenko wrote this paper really fast. It says, okay, he says, well, there is sentiment. And in central bank communication, we have the voice of monetary policy actually analyzing the sentiment. Says, okay, we have someone with power actually moving the literature because it sees that the literature sees that there is value in that. Now, trying to say definite things like about sentiment, about one specific measure, I wouldn't dare to do that. And actually, that's the reason I'm trying to explore that part of the neuroscience in terms of what is sentiment, in terms of what is our definition of sentiment, and actually that's the problem, that we don't have a unique definition in terms of sentiment. But actually, even we don't have unique, because we would like to have, like mathematics, to have, you know, pretty certain, actually is playing a role. So we have something that is sentiment, that you do different measures, is collecting certain parts of that type of sentiment, okay? So we have something that is like a big set that you can measure in different ways, okay? That you will tackle that part of sentiment. that you don't have like a unique. If we were robots, we will have a unique form. Maybe at some point, if we talk with the designer of the universe, we will be able to understand what is sentiment and how we can tackle. But yeah, we have to be careful with the measure because sometimes results might not be really robust to the different measures. If you take in a design 3, 4, 5 different measures and you're getting the results, then probably there is something happening there in terms of the sentiment. But yeah, pretty good comment. Thank you.
Well, we've run out of time, 3 minutes ago, so I want to thank again the presenters. Congratulations on your hard work, and thank you all for staying with us through the end. We're finished for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.